Welcome to Resolve IBS and IBD Naturally. I'm Courtney Cowie, a nutrition therapy and functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. If you are struggling with the symptoms of IBS or IBD and want to get to the root cause of your symptoms so you can take back your health through a whole person approach, this podcast is for you. Just a disclaimer that the information I'm presenting in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. You should always consult a qualified practitioner before making any changes to your health or medical regimen. That being said, let's get on with the show. So in this episode 3, I'm going to be addressing the question that I find comes up often for people struggling with chronic gut symptoms, and that is there something more serious underlying my IBS symptoms? Now, obviously, this isn't a question I can answer. I'm certainly not entitled to give medical advice, especially in this case. This is more of a question I find tends to really come up on the journey of gut dysfunction, especially when you've been struggling for a long time. I know this was a question that I grappled with even after I had been to the GI doc many times and multiple different GI doctors. I think it's more pertinent to IBS because this does tend to be the camp of people that go through a battery of GI conventional tests. Nothing really specific is found. They're given this IBS diagnosis. They're given maybe some probiotics or other suggestions to try by the GI doc. And then when those things don't work well, they start to perseverate and worry because the symptoms will often go on. They're not getting the relief they're looking for. And they start to wonder, gee, was something missed? Is there something else going on? Did my doctor just not do a thorough enough workup? I know I for sure struggled with that question for quite a while before I went back in and achieved a second diagnosis of IBD. But in many cases, people can struggle at quite a significant level and really never reach that more serious diagnosis. So I just want to touch on this because, again, I feel like a lot of mental anxiety and worry is really, really common with this population of folks struggling with chronic gut symptoms. So, what I want to say in answer to this question is something more serious underlying my IBS symptoms is yes and no. If you've done the things like going in to see your doctor, which is obviously a very prudent first step, I always recommend, even with my clients that elect to work with me, that if we find something that's suggesting a potentially more serious concern on, say, the functional stool test I'm running, to always follow up with a doctor just to rule out something more serious. Oftentimes, they've already been down that road, especially in the recent past. They've gotten a pretty full, thorough checkup, and they know that there isn't anything serious that's been found. And so it kind of gives them that clearance and that confidence that, like, we've checked that box. Now we can start to do work on the more holistic end and see if we can troubleshoot this through a more functional approach, which is great. But if you haven't considered a functional approach and you've only done the conventional approach and feel like you haven't gotten the answers, definitely it makes sense if you're having serious symptoms, especially. One of the big red flags for me is blood coming out in the stool, anything on the level of, serious disruption and function, major energy problems, that type of thing. It definitely makes sense to get that checked out and anything more serious ruled out. So if you've done that and you've gone through the measures of having an endoscopy, a colonoscopy, some other GI tests done, and you've ruled out something more serious, then there's a good chance that there really isn't anything more serious on the spectrum of conventional diagnoses going on with the IBS symptoms. Now, the other side of that coin is, are there potentially significant things going on that are driving these symptoms from more of a functional perspective? And by that, I mean some of the clues that we tend to look for when we do our testing initially to try to figure out, okay, what might be some imbalances or potentially problematic factors that are driving this symptom picture. And so we'll often run different types of tests compared to conventional doctors. And I will be getting into that more in the coming episodes. But often with gut clients, especially, I'm going to be suggesting a good functional stool test, often using PCR technology, which really does look at things at a little bit more microscopic level. And it's more sensitive to different imbalances that might show up in the gut. Other testing that I might consider are things like hormone testing, micronutrient testing, organic acids testing, toxin testing, as well as other things. These are just, a battery of tests that might come up on my radar based on an initial consultation with a client where I'm taking stock of the symptom picture and trying to think through what might be some likely scenarios I think are at play. And this helps me as a practitioner to try to potentially rule in or rule out underlying imbalances or other issues I think might be at play with this particular situation. And believe it or not, beyond just stool testing, there are certainly a number of other things, whether they're imbalances in the body, micronutrient deficiencies, sometimes macronutrient deficiencies, um, energy blocks, toxin exposure, those types of things can all, believe it or not, impact gut function and add to and contribute to gut symptomology. So, you know, in my world, it's important to identify as many of those key factors as possible without running the whole kitchen sink on people as well. So, I'm just kind of laying the groundwork for, how I would start to address this question of what's driving potentially an IBS picture from a functional lens, so long as the more serious diagnoses have been ruled out. Now, in my opinion, I think it's really important to try to quantitatively measure and look at digestive function as much as possible. A good functional stool test will absolutely do that. Nutritional deficiencies can sometimes actually be, in my opinion, identified on even just looking at a food journal and what a person's eating. A lot of times patterns will jump out. I'll start to recognize that there might be some serious deficiencies in certain macronutrient groups. There might be some food quality issues, some inflammatory foods that are being consumed that are likely to lead to potentially problematic nutrient deficiencies. And just doing that subjective work can actually be very productive in letting me help a client get clarity on where I think there's some good changes to be made in their dietary approach. However, there are times where it makes sense to literally try to get data on nutrient deficiencies, whether that's looking at, blood, looking at urine through organic acids, that type of thing, just to see, are we seeing some major deficiencies show up that might be important in terms of cofactors or supporting different enzymatic processes in the body that help to support digestive function or energy production. There can be other blocks to energy production. That's one of the reasons why I love doing organic acids testing in certain cases. It can really get clear on some different inhibiting factors that are preventing overall energy production, which, by the way, deficiencies in cellular energy production are linked with just about every chronic illness. So we could say in another way that when function starts to break down at the cellular level, sooner or later, we're going to see that play out in the tissues and systems of the body. And that will just depend on every individual's weak link and genetic predisposition as to which of those switches get flipped because of these energy deficiencies that show up. There can often be things like hidden gut infections that, again, the functional stool tests that most practitioners in the functional space like to work with are going to use technology that is more sensitive, in my experience, to these types of latent infections than just the regular stool culture testing that conventional medicine likes to run. And that can be very helpful. And I've seen time and time again, correlating those clues on functional stool tests with a client's symptoms, helping a client to work on a protocol to balance the microbiome and then getting very good results with that. And I will actually be talking quite in depth about functional stool testing because I feel like I've come across a lot of different opinions and beliefs on the validity of stool tests, not only in prospective clients, but obviously there's a lot of practitioners out in the functional space who are either very much a fan of functional stool testing or don't like it at all. And so I will be speaking from my training and my experience. I do actually think it's a very great tool. I think it's often very useful for me. I've seen a lot of correlation between different imbalances I've seen in stool tests and the client's symptoms as they've presented when they've come to work with me. So, again, just from my experience, I found it to be incredibly helpful. Other things that might come into play, toxic exposure, which is actually quite widespread in our world. Believe it or not, it's not something that most of us are even aware of. And it's not like most people have an immense toxic exposure and then realize it because they have these immediate after effects. I think the truth of it is most of us are getting exposed on a greater and greater level as time goes on because toxins are being incorporated into more consumer goods, just even the homes we live in, materials we handle every day, the reality of some of our building environments. We're going to get into detail on all of these things in the coming episodes. But believe it or not, today's generation is absolutely being born into a more toxic, heavy environment than we were, or our parents were, or our grandparents were. And I believe this is going to become more and more of an inhibiting factor in terms of allowing the body to function at a healthy level. And again, will play out in a negative way. And in those prone to gut disorders, can be another contributing factor to signal those genes. The other thing that's very much connected are hormone imbalances, and that's all types of hormones. Often I see a good degree of HPA axis dysregulation. HPA stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and that's generally speaking the axis of three glands that helps to regulate the stress response. Which is really something that gets engaged for most of us in the day-to-day modern world. I would argue that the majority of the clients I've worked with have a pretty significant stress load, whether that's coming from work stress, home stress, the stress of being a parent, relationship stress, all kinds of things, right? And so this is a reality that I feel has to be looked at and addressed as part of a holistic health optimization plan. But not only adrenal hormones, but eventually sex hormones get impacted in chronic illness. Thyroid hormone can often, thyroid can get impacted very easily. I see a uh, very strong connection between thyroid dysregulation and gut disorders, as well as thyroid dysregulation and autoimmune conditions. It's very, very common. And then this goes kind of hand in hand with the whole hormonal balance picture, but I feel like nervous system function is a big part of gut disorders as well. And again, our nervous system, I think, in some ways is the most sensitive system of the body. It has the capacity to pick up information, especially at the subconscious brain level, often before we even consciously are aware of it. And I think whether it's because of modern technology, being in Wi-Fi rigged environments, being surrounded by technology that gives off strong signals all day, having a lot on our plates, the overwhelm of day-to-day living, all of that is going to overload and tax our nervous system in a way that just didn't happen 50, 100 years ago. And so it's another driving factor that's going to put a barrier in place when it comes to optimizing gut function that very much does need to be considered in the whole spectrum of, something like IBS, especially where we're not getting obvious answers or diagnoses from the conventional side of things. So I wanted to kind of just give that short preview into, things to consider and look at, things I certainly start to think about when I'm first interacting with an IBS client or a client who's been giving the diagnosis of IBS. And again, every person is very different in how they're presenting. In my initial consultation, I do try to get a very good handle on multiple different areas of health, including, stresses and environment and all of those things, just so I have more clarity on what do I think would warrant further functional testing, what clues do we maybe need to go gather to confirm or, discard some potential hypotheses we might have here. Everyone's situation is a bit different, but I think that in general, doing that type of Q&A process and investigation at a pretty thorough level with a client really helps to point us in some good directions to start to get to the root of what might be some of the contributing factors here. And I think just going on that journey starts to already alleviate that stress and that anxiety around this question of like, okay, nothing's really been found technically wrong with me, but I still worry there might be something more serious going on. And, I do want to reinforce the point that certainly if there are latent imbalances, dysbiosis, infections in the gut, if there is toxin accumulation, if there's been toxic exposure, could those things over time eventually contribute to a more serious health issue? Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, in my opinion, the real value of doing this kind of work is it allows you to proactively try to identify some things that might be driving imbalance and driving chronic disease processes in the body at an earlier stage before things progress or before, you get older and the body, it just becomes harder to bring things back into balance. And so there's a very proactive aspect to doing this work from a functional standpoint. However, things like toxins and latent gut infections that aren't going to show up on stool culture tests wouldn't necessarily be considered serious issues through a conventional medicine lens. So, it all kind of depends on the eye of the beholder and how proactive you want to be around your health and how proactive you want to be around troubleshooting and trying to help the body correct imbalances at an earlier stage in the development of disease versus letting things kind of go and, potentially snowball into a more serious thing. So, before I wrap this episode up, I did want to mention that I do have a free e-guide on my website, which is CourtneyCowie.com. Last name is Cowie. That is actually given for people struggling with specifically IBSD or symptoms of IBD, more in that vein, to help them try to use some very smart nutritional strategies to see if they can support their body back to health. And so these are some of my tried and true like techniques and strategies I've used with lots and lots of clients successfully that are things you can easily troubleshoot on your own. And again, it is a free guide. I do give very specific tips. These are things that you can absolutely try on your own safely to help support your gut into better function and better health. So if you're in that camp and you're struggling with IBSD or IBD and you're looking for a free resource to try to help you get on a better track, definitely go over to my website and download my free e-guide, which again is CourtneyCowie.com. Did you find this episode informative and helpful? I'd love to have you leave me a 5-star rating. Do you have questions about holistic approaches to optimizing gut health that you'd like to ask? Please leave your question or comment below, and I will be sure to address it personally or cover it in a future episode. Be sure to check the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode. See you next time.